The polished obsidian of the Bentley Continental reflected the pale afternoon sun with an insolent gleam. It was a car that didn't belong on this quiet, suburban street, lined with well-kept but modest family homes. It was a declaration, a monument to arrogance parked at the curb directly in front of Ethan's own house. He recognized it instantly. It was his brother-in-law, Julian's car. And it was here on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon when Ethan was supposed to be chained to his drafting table across town, working the 70-hour weeks that paid for this house, this life, and his wife Clara's effortless elegance. He had come home early, a rare gift from a project that had wrapped ahead of schedule, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. That lightness evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy knot in his stomach. He had worked for years, sacrificing sleep, hobbies, and time with his wife, all to build a foundation he thought they both wanted. He endured the condescension of her family, the pitying looks, the backhanded compliments. Julian in particular seemed to derive a special pleasure from highlighting Ethan's perceived station in life. A diligent but unremarkable architect, a workhorse for a larger, more important firm. Ethan had tolerated it all with a patient smile, secure in a truth he held close to his chest, a truth locked away like the documents in the worn leather portfolio he now gripped in his hand. He thought he had more time before the final pieces fell into place. He thought the game had a few more moves left to play. But the sight of that car, so brazen and unapologetic, told him the game had just been violently accelerated. What Julian didn't know, what Clara didn't know, was that the man they saw as a humble provider was not the man who actually existed. And within the next hour, the carefully constructed world they all inhabited was going to be demolished, right down to its foundations. It's a story about the quiet strength that builds in the shadows of disrespect, isn't it? About what happens when the person everyone underestimates finally decides to show their hand. I wonder if you've ever been in a situation like that, where you knew more than you were letting on. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy watching prideful people get their long overdue comeuppance, I think you're going to want to stick around for this. Make sure you're subscribed, because the fallout from this afternoon is something you won't want to miss. Ethan killed the engine of his sensible 4-year-old sedan. The silence that followed was louder than the engine's hum. He didn't move. He just sat, staring at the Bentley. It was more than a car. It was a symbol of everything Julian represented. New money, loud, and utterly convinced of its own superiority. Julian had inherited his father's real estate development company, and in the 5 years since, had managed to not run it into the ground, a feat he mistook for genius. He treated Ethan with a kind of amused disdain, the way a lord might look at a stable hand who was surprisingly good with the horses. The stable hand was useful, necessary even, but would never be invited to dine at the main table. And Ethan, for reasons of his own, had played the part. He had nodded at Julian's unsolicited financial advice, accepted his cast-off designer watches with a quiet, "Thank you," and never, ever corrected his assumptions about Ethan's salary or prospects. He let Julian believe he was a mid-level drone at a large, impersonal architectural firm, Crawford and Associates. He let him believe the long hours were a sign of struggle, not strategy. The deception was a heavy cloak, but a necessary one. It was the scaffolding for the life he was secretly building. His hand tightened on the handle of his leather portfolio. To anyone else, it was a simple, functional satchel, its hide softened and creased with years of use. It looked like the accessory of a man who carried blueprints and sketches. Inside, however, there were no sketches. There was a single, thick envelope. Within that envelope were the incorporation documents for E. Vance Design, a boutique architectural firm Ethan had founded 3 years ago. There were the deeds to the downtown office building that housed the firm, a property he owned outright. And there was the preliminary contract for the Northgate Tower project, the most ambitious and prestigious commercial development the city had seen in a decade. A project Julian's development company was desperately, publicly trying to secure. What Julian didn't know was that the lead architect he was trying to woo, the mysterious and reclusive E. Vance, was the same man he patronized at family dinners. The 70-hour weeks were real, but they weren't for Crawford and associates. They were for himself. They were the price of building an empire in silence. He had planned the reveal for his and Clara's upcoming anniversary. A quiet dinner, a bottle of the vintage wine he knew she loved. He would finally lay the contents of the portfolio on the table, not as a victory, but as a gift. This is what I've been building for us. This is the future I promised you. He had imagined the look on her face, the surprise, the joy, the dawning realization. He wanted it to be a moment of shared triumph, a private celebration of their journey. But Julian's presence here, now, tainted that fantasy. It suggested a rot in the foundation that Ethan had refused to see. Clara knew he was supposed to be at work. Julian's visit wasn't a casual drop-in. It was a clandestine meeting. And there was only one topic that could warrant such secrecy: him. A cold anger, sharp and clean, began to cut through his shock. It wasn't the wild, hot anger of jealousy. It was the focused fury of a master craftsman who finds a flaw in his most important work. He had endured so much, not for his own ego, but for the life he was building with Clara. He had believed she was a partner in that, even if she didn't know the full picture. He had believed her failure to defend him against her family's scorn was a product of her non-confrontational nature, not a lack of faith in him. He had made excuses for her, telling himself that once the truth was revealed, her loyalty would be absolute. Now he wasn't so sure. That single, gleaming car was a mirror, reflecting a possibility he had refused to entertain, that his wife was not a silent supporter, but a silent enabler, perhaps even a co-conspirator in his own humiliation. He took a deep, steadying breath, the kind he took before a major client presentation. The plan had changed. The anniversary dinner was canceled. The reveal would happen today, not as a gift, but as a judgment. He opened the car door, the soft click echoing in the unnatural quiet of the street. He walked up the stone path to his own front door, the portfolio held not like a satchel, but like a weapon. The quiet man was about to make a very loud noise. The family dinners were the worst. They were Julian's stage, and Ethan was his unwilling, unpaid supporting actor. The last one, 2 weeks prior, had been particularly excruciating. It was at Julian and his parents' sprawling estate, a house of beige marble and oversized furniture that screamed of a decorator paid by the square foot. Ethan and Clara had arrived right on time, which in the world of Clara's family meant they were the first ones there. Julian had made his entrance a fashionable 30 minutes later, kissing his mother, clapping his father on the back, and greeting Ethan with a look that managed to be both pitying and dismissive at the same time. "Ethan, good to see you, man," he'd said, his voice booming through the cavernous living room. "Still burning the midnight oil for old man Crawford? You've got to learn to set boundaries. They're taking advantage of your work ethic." Ethan had offered a tight, polite smile. "The project's in a critical phase. It needs the hours." "See, that's what they tell you," Julian had countered, waving a dismissive hand as he poured himself a generous measure of scotch. "It's always a critical phase. They dangle that promotion in front of you like a carrot, and you just keep pulling the cart. It's a mug's game." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes scanning Ethan's simple, well-tailored but unassuming navy blazer. "Clara, honey, we need to get this man a proper tailor. He's working himself to the bone. The least he can do is look the part of a successful architect." Clara had laughed, a light, tinkling sound that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, leave him alone, Julian. You know Ethan doesn't care about clothes." It was a weak defense, and they all knew it. It was an excuse, not a rebuttal. It conceded Julian's premise that Ethan's appearance was lacking rather than challenging it. Ethan felt the familiar sting of it. He looked at his wife, hoping to see a flicker of solidarity, a hint of defiance on his behalf. He saw only a practiced, placid smile, the one she wore to keep the peace. In that moment, she was her brother's sister, a member of a tribe to which he would never truly belong, the silent enabler. He had registered the hurt, filed it away with a dozen other similar slights, and maintained his composure. He had let the comment hang in the air, unanswered, a tactic he'd learned was more effective than arguing. His silence often made them more uncomfortable than any retort could. Later, over dinner, Julian had held court, regaling the table with tales of his latest business conquests. He spoke of crushing competitors, of flipping properties for obscene profits, and of the upcoming Northgate Tower project. "It's the big one," he'd announced, leaning back in his chair with an air of supreme confidence. "Biggest development in the city's history, and I'm telling you, we're this close to landing it." He held up his thumb and forefinger, a bare millimeter apart. "There's this one architectural firm, some new boutique outfit, Vance Design. They're the darlings of the moment, very exclusive, very modern. The city council loves them, but I've got an inside track. Their lead designer is a recluse, never meets clients face to face. All mystique and ego. I'll win them over. You can't build a billion-dollar tower with an email address. You need a handshake. You need a relationship." Ethan had felt a tremor of something electric under the table. He had continued cutting his filet mignon with meticulous precision, his face a mask of mild interest. Vance Design, his firm, the reclusive designer, him. Julian was, at that very moment, boasting about his strategy to defeat a man he was simultaneously insulting to his face. The dramatic irony was so thick Ethan could have sliced it with his steak knife. He risked a glance at Clara. She was watching Julian with rapt attention, her expression one of genuine admiration for her brother's ambition. There was no hint that she connected the name of the firm with the Vance in her own husband's name, Ethan Vance. To her, he was just Ethan. The name on the marriage certificate was just a name. The hidden power it held was a concept she couldn't imagine. It was then that Ethan had subtly, almost unconsciously, reached down and touched the corner of the leather portfolio resting by his chair. The worn leather was a comfort, a tangible link to the truth. It was his anchor in this sea of condescension. Inside it lay the proof that he was not the man they thought he was. He was not the cart horse. He was the one who owned the entire stable. Julian's confident pronouncements about the Northgate project were pure bluster. Ethan knew this because he had spent the previous week in quiet, intense, final stage negotiations with the city council and the project's primary investors. The deal was done. The contract, resting in his portfolio, was just waiting for a final signature. Julian wasn't this close to landing the project. He had already lost it. He just didn't know it yet. He was a character in a play, reading his lines with gusto, completely unaware that the author was sitting across the table from him, already writing the final, tragic act. The humiliation of that dinner, layered on top of countless others, had solidified Ethan's resolve. The reveal couldn't just be a private moment with Clara anymore. It had to be a lesson for all of them. A lesson in the profound danger of underestimating the quiet man in the room. The office of Vance Design was the antithesis of Julian's world. It was a space defined by quiet confidence and understated elegance. Located on the top 2 floors of a restored heritage building in the city's historic district, the building Ethan owned, it was a symphony of reclaimed wood, exposed brick, and clean, minimalist lines. There were no gold fixtures, no marble expanses. The luxury was in the quality of the materials, the intelligence of the design, and the palpable atmosphere of focused creativity. Ethan's private office was in a corner, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. This was his sanctuary, the place where the 70-hour weeks became tangible progress. He employed a small, elite team of 12 architects and designers, all of them brilliant, all of them fiercely loyal. They were the only ones who knew the truth, that Ethan Vance, the man who sometimes came to work in a simple sweater and jeans, was the visionary founder and sole owner of the firm. They called him Ethan, not Mr. Vance, at his insistence. The hierarchy was flat, the respect earned, not demanded. His second in command, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria, had been with him from the very beginning. She was more than an employee, she was a confidant and a co-conspirator in his double life. She handled the day-to-day operations, acting as the public face of the firm when necessary, allowing Ethan to maintain his carefully guarded anonymity. It was Maria who had first flagged Julian's company, Sterling Development, as a bidder for the Northgate project. "You know this guy, right?" she had asked, sliding a file across Ethan's massive oak desk. "Julian Sterling, aggressive, legacy money, thinks he's a titan of industry, but he's really just riding his father's coattails." Ethan had picked up the file, a wry smile touching his lips. "He's my brother-in-law." Maria had blinked, her professional composure momentarily fractured. "You're kidding." "I wish I were." "Does he know?" "He thinks I'm a junior draftsman at Crawford and Associates," Ethan had replied, flipping through the pages of Julian's proposal. It was flashy, full of buzzwords and renderings that were more style than substance. It was a proposal designed to impress amateurs, not seasoned professionals. "He thinks I'm barely qualified to design a garden shed." Maria had shaken her head, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Oh, this is going to be good. This is going to be very, very good. Are we going to crush him?" "We're not going to crush him," Ethan had corrected gently, though the temptation was there. "We're going to present a superior design, a more viable financial model, and a more compelling vision for the city. We're going to win on merit. The fact that he's my brother-in-law is irrelevant to the project." But it wasn't irrelevant to Ethan. It was the entire point. It was the engine driving him through the sleepless nights and endless revisions. Every line he drew, every calculation he made, was imbued with the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was competing against his own tormentor on a field of battle Julian didn't even know existed. The week before the disastrous family dinner, Julian had made a move that crossed a line from casual condescension to active interference. He had called Ethan's supposed boss, Mr. Crawford, a man Ethan hadn't actually worked for in over 3 years. Ethan only found out because Crawford, an old mentor and friend who was in on the secret, had called him immediately after. "Ethan," Crawford had said, his voice a mix of amusement and indignation, "you're not going to believe this. Your brother-in-law, Julian Sterling, just called me. He wanted to have an off-the-record chat about you." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What did he say?" "He said he was concerned about you, said you were working too hard, that you seemed stressed, and that maybe you weren't cut out for the high-pressure environment of a top-tier firm." Crawford had paused for effect. He then had the gall to suggest that maybe it would be a kindness for me to manage you out of the company, find a way to let you go for your own good. He said, and I quote, "The guy's a good workhorse, but he doesn't have the vision. He's reached his ceiling. He was trying to get you fired, Ethan." The audacity of it was breathtaking. Julian, in his infinite arrogance, had tried to sabotage the career of the man who was funding his sister's life, framing it as an act of mercy. He was trying to kneecap the workhorse to, what, prove a point? To make Ethan even more dependent and pathetic in his eyes? It was a move of such casual cruelty, so utterly devoid of self-awareness, that it clarified everything for Ethan. This wasn't just about ego anymore. This was about a fundamental sickness in Julian's character, a need to diminish others to feel large. And Clara's family, by tolerating and even encouraging this behavior, were all complicit. "What did you tell him?" Ethan had asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I told him that your performance was exemplary and that your future at the firm was secure," Crawford had said, a chuckle in his voice. "I told him that, in fact, you were one of our most valuable assets. I laid it on pretty thick. I think he was genuinely confused that I wasn't agreeing with him. The sheer arrogance of the man, to call an employer and tell him his own business." After that call, Ethan had stayed in his office long after everyone else had gone home. He hadn't worked. He had just sat in the dark, watching the city lights flicker to life. The game had changed. Julian hadn't just insulted him, he had tried to actively harm him. He had tried to take away his livelihood, or what he perceived his livelihood to be. The quiet, patient strategy of waiting for the perfect moment felt inadequate now. A simple reveal over dinner was no longer enough. This required a response that was as decisive and impactful as the offense itself. It required a public reckoning, a demolition. And as he sat there, the seeds of a new plan began to form. A plan that would culminate not in a quiet dinner, but in a confrontation that would force everyone to see the truth, whether they wanted to or not. The charity gala a week later was the perfect stage. It was one of the city's premier social events, a glittering affair attended by everyone who was anyone in the worlds of business, politics, and society. Julian and his family were major sponsors, their name emblazoned on the event program. It was their territory. Walking into the grand ballroom on Clara's arm, Ethan felt like a spy infiltrating enemy headquarters. He wore a classic, perfectly tailored tuxedo, one from his own wardrobe, not one Clara had picked out, but he knew that to Julian's eyes, it would still look like a rental. Clara looked radiant in a silver gown, a vision of effortless grace. But as they moved through the crowd, Ethan felt a familiar distance growing between them. She was in her element, greeting people, laughing, and basking in the reflected glow of her family's prominence. He was an accessory, the quiet, vaguely unimpressive husband on her arm. They inevitably found their way to the Sterling family's designated table, a prime spot near the stage. Julian was holding court, a glass of champagne in one hand, gesturing expansively with the other. He spotted them approaching, and his face broke into a wide, predatory smile. "Ah, the happy couple. Clara, you look stunning. And Ethan, you clean up nice. Decided to give the old drafting table a night off, eh?" The jab was predictable, almost comforting in its lack of imagination. The small group of business associates around Julian chuckled politely. "We all need a night off now and then, Julian," Ethan replied, his voice even and calm. He met Julian's gaze without flinching. "Absolutely," Julian boomed, turning to one of his associates, a man named Marcus. "Ethan here is one of the most diligent architects in the city, puts in more hours than anyone I know. I keep telling him, you gotta learn to delegate, my friend. Work smart, not hard." He clapped Ethan on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look friendly, but was pure condescension. "But he's a company man, through and through, loyal to a fault." Ethan just smiled. He could feel Clara shifting uncomfortably beside him. She wanted him to say something, to defend himself, but she also didn't want a scene. It was the paradox she lived in, wanting him to have a spine while simultaneously hoping he wouldn't use it to upset the delicate social balance. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. His fingers brushed against a thin, crisp envelope. It wasn't the main portfolio. That was too bulky for a black tie event. This was just one page from it, a single, powerful page. It was a copy of the letter of intent from the City Council, officially awarding the Northgate Tower project to E. Vance Design. It was signed by the mayor herself. He had brought it for a reason. He had considered, for a fleeting moment, revealing it right there, in the middle of Julian's triumphant monologue. But no, the timing wasn't right. The impact would be greater if Julian was at the absolute peak of his arrogance. This was just a rehearsal. The main speaker for the evening was the mayor, a savvy and respected politician. After the dinner service, she took the stage to thank the sponsors and to speak about the future of the city. It's a future of bold growth, of smart development, and of visionary projects that will define our skyline for a generation to come, she announced, her voice resonating through the ballroom. And there is no project more visionary than the Northgate Tower. A murmur of excitement went through the crowd. Julian sat up straighter, a preening, self-satisfied look on his face. He caught Ethan's eye and gave him a subtle wink, as if to say, "Watch this. This is about me." After a long and incredibly competitive selection process, the mayor continued, "I am thrilled to offer a small preview of the firm whose design captivated the council and secured the contract." She gestured to the large screens flanking the stage. "A firm that has, in a very short time, established itself as a leader in sustainable and human-centric design. A firm whose principal designer, though famously private, has a vision that is simply undeniable." Julian was practically vibrating with anticipation. He had a glass of champagne ready for a toast. He was so certain. The screens flickered to life, not with the logo of Sterling Development, but with the elegant, minimalist EV insignia of E. Vance Design. A stunning 3D rendering of the Northgate Tower began to rotate on the screen. It was a breathtaking design, a graceful, spiraling structure that seemed to defy gravity. It was Ethan's design, his masterpiece. A confused silence fell over the Sterling table. Julian's smile froze, then collapsed. He stared at the screen, then at the program, then back at the screen. E. Vance. "Who the hell is E. Vance?" he muttered, his voice tight with disbelief and fury. Ethan watched him, his own expression unreadable. He saw the exact moment the blood drained from Julian's face. He saw the dawning horror, the frantic mental calculations. He had been played, outmaneuvered, humiliated on the biggest possible stage. Clara looked from the screen to Julian, her brow furrowed in confusion. Then she looked at Ethan. He simply met her gaze, holding it for a long moment. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just let her see the quiet, unshakable confidence in his eyes. He let the question hang in the air between them. The name of the firm on the screen was E. Vance Design. Her husband's name was Ethan Vance. She was smart. She had to see the connection. But as he watched her, he saw not dawning realization, but only a reflection of her brother's confusion. The possibility was so far outside her conception of him that she couldn't make the leap. To her, he was still just Ethan, the workhorse architect, the man who couldn't possibly be behind something so grand. And in that moment, the last vestiges of Ethan's hope for a gentle reveal, for a shared victory, died. She hadn't earned it. The drive home from the gala was silent and thick with tension. Clara kept casting worried glances at him, misinterpreting his silence as sullenness or jealousy over the success of a rival firm. "It's a stunning design," she'd offered tentatively. "I'm sure your firm will get the next big one." He hadn't responded. There was nothing to say. He was done playing the part. The final act was upon him, which brought him back to this moment, sitting in his car, staring at Julian's Bentley. The gala had been the public humiliation. This, he suspected, was the private betrayal. This was Julian, having been defeated in the professional sphere, attempting to salvage his ego by destroying Ethan's personal life. He was likely inside right now, spinning a tale of Ethan's failure, painting him as a loser who couldn't even compete for the big prize, trying to poison Clara's mind against him for good. The irony was devastating. Julian was using Ethan's greatest triumph as a weapon against him, without even knowing it was his. Ethan finally pushed the car door open and walked toward his front door. The quiet before the storm was over. The storm had arrived. He slipped his key into the lock. It turned with a familiar, smooth click. The house was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that feels staged, a held breath. He could hear the faint, urgent murmur of voices coming from the living room. He set his portfolio down on the small table in the entryway, placing it with deliberate care. He took off his jacket, draping it over a chair. He was unbuttoning his cuffs, rolling up his sleeves as he walked slowly toward the sound. It was a gesture of preparation, the way a man prepares for hard work. The living room was sun-drenched, the light illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Clara was on the sofa, her posture rigid. Julian was pacing in front of the fireplace, his hands gesticulating wildly. He was in the middle of a sentence, his voice a low, condescending rumble. "And that's the point, Clara. The man is a nobody. He was humiliated at that gala. We all were, by extension. He aims low. He's content to be a cog in a machine. Is that the man you want to be tied to for the rest of your life? A man with no ambition, no vision?" "Julian, that's not fair," Clara said, but her voice was weak, lacking conviction. It was the protest of someone who secretly agreed. "Fair? I'm talking about your future." Julian spun around, his face flushed. "I'm trying to protect you. I have friends, powerful men, men who can give you the life you deserve. Not this comfortable little existence paid for by the sweat of a man who has hit his ceiling. You saw that tower. That's the world I live in. Your husband can't even get a foot in the door of that world. He's playing in the minor leagues, Clara, and you're married to him." Ethan stood in the doorway, listening. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a scene from a play for which he already knew the ending. Every word Julian spoke was another nail in his own coffin. Every dismissive phrase, every arrogant assumption was a gift to Ethan. Julian was making his case for him. He was demonstrating with perfect clarity the depth of his own ignorance and prejudice. Ethan let the silence stretch for a moment after Julian finished his tirade. He watched as his wife, Clara, didn't refute her brother. She didn't defend her husband. She just sat there, looking down at her hands, trapped in a web of indecision. She was weighing her options, weighing her comfortable life with Ethan against the glittering, ambitious world Julian was offering. And in her silence, Ethan got his answer. She was considering it. "He has a point, you know." Ethan's voice was calm, conversational. It cut through the tension in the room like a scalpel. Julian and Clara both jumped, their heads snapping toward the doorway. Julian's face went from flushed with passion to pale with shock. Clara looked horrified, her hand flying to her mouth. "Ethan, you're home." "It appears I am," Ethan said, walking slowly into the room. He didn't look at Clara. His eyes were fixed on Julian. "You were making a compelling argument. Please continue. You were saying something about the minor leagues?" He stopped in the center of the room, creating a triangle between the three of them. The power dynamic, which had been so clearly tilted toward Julian, was suddenly, inexplicably, destabilized. Ethan's calm was unnerving. It wasn't the reaction of a man who had just overheard his own character assassination. It was the reaction of a man who was in complete control. Julian, ever the bully, recovered quickly, mistaking calm for weakness. He puffed out his chest, adopting a tone of false sincerity. "Look, Ethan, man, I'm sorry you had to hear that. This is a private family conversation." "It stopped being a family conversation the moment it became about my ambition and my ability to provide for my wife," Ethan replied, his voice still unnervingly level. "And since I am the subject, I think I'm entitled to participate. In fact, I'd like to hear more. Tell me about my ceiling. Tell me about the world I can't get a foot into. Educate me." He gestured to the armchair opposite the sofa. "Please, I'm all ears." This was not the script Julian had prepared for. He had expected a confrontation, yelling, accusations. He had expected Ethan to be emotional, hurt, and defensive. That was a fight Julian knew how to win. He could dismiss emotion as weakness. But this cold, analytical curiosity was disarming. It was like trying to punch smoke. He glanced at Clara, looking for support, but she was staring at Ethan, a new, uncertain expression on her face. She had never seen him like this. The quiet, agreeable man she knew was gone, replaced by this calm, commanding stranger. "There's nothing to educate you about," Julian stammered, falling back on bluster. "The proof was on that screen at the gala for everyone to see. Some mystery firm swoops in and gets the biggest prize, and you're not even in the game. That's it. That's the whole story." "Is it?" Ethan asked softly. He let the question hang in the air. "The whole story? Are you sure about that?" He walked over to the entryway and picked up his leather portfolio. He brought it back into the room and held it in his hands, his fingers resting on the worn clasp. "You know, you've been giving me advice for years, Julian, about my career, my finances, my work ethic. You've made a great many assumptions about me, about my life, about my limits." He looked from Julian to Clara, and for the first time, a flicker of cold anger showed in his eyes. "You both have." Clara flinched as if struck. "Ethan, that's not true." "Isn't it?" he countered, his voice still quiet but now laced with steel. "Have you ever, once, defended me when he called me a workhorse? When he insulted my clothes, my ambition, my entire existence? Have you ever, once, suggested that maybe, just maybe, you had faith in the man you married?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his full attention back to Julian. "And you tried to get me fired." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. The last of the color drained from Julian's face. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Ethan said. "You called my boss Mr. Crawford. You told him I'd hit my ceiling. You suggested he manage me out as a kindness. You tried to sabotage my livelihood, Julian. A livelihood that, for all your condescension, pays for the house your sister lives in and the car she drives." He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle in the silent room. "You did all this while simultaneously trying to win a contract from a firm you knew nothing about. You dismissed them as all mystique and ego. You were so sure you could win them over with your handshake and your relationship. Your arrogance, your utter lack of curiosity was staggering." Ethan placed the portfolio on the heavy oak coffee table between them. The sound was a soft, definitive thud. "You wanted to know the whole story, Julian. All right, let's talk about the whole story." He undid the clasp. The leather creaked softly. He didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, methodical. He was no longer just a husband or a brother-in-law. He was a presenter, a strategist, an architect unveiling his final, most important design. "You seem to be under the impression that I work for Crawford and Associates. I haven't worked there for 3 years. Mr. Crawford is an old friend and a mentor, and he has been kind enough to maintain that fiction for me." He reached into the portfolio and pulled out the first document, a thick sheaf of papers bound in blue. He slid it across the polished wood surface of the table toward Julian. "These are the incorporation documents for E. Vance Design. Founded 3 years ago. Sole proprietor Ethan Vance. That's me." Julian stared at the document as if it were a snake. He didn't touch it. His mind was refusing to process the information. What is this? This is some kind of joke." "I assure you, I'm not joking," Ethan said calmly. He reached back into the portfolio. "You were right. The firm's lead designer is famously private. It's a useful strategy. It allows the work to speak for itself. It keeps people like you, who value bluster over substance, at a comfortable distance." He pulled out a second document and placed it on the table. It was a property deed. "You were admiring my office building the other day when you were downtown. The restored Heritage Building on Elm Street. You mentioned to Clara that you'd love to know who owned it. Well, now you know." The deed clearly stated the owner of the building that housed E. Vance Design was a holding company, a company wholly owned by Ethan Vance. Clara made a small, choked sound. She was staring at the documents, then at Ethan, her face a mask of disbelief. The world she knew was tilting on its axis. The man she thought she had married, the simple, steady, unambitious man, had never existed. He was a fiction, a role he had been playing for years. "But how?" she whispered. "The hours, the work. I thought—" "The hours were real," Ethan said, his voice softening for a moment as he looked at her. "The work was real. It just wasn't for someone else. It was for us. It was for this." His gesture encompassed the room, the house, their life. "I wanted to build something real, something lasting, something that was ours, free and clear. I didn't want to be beholden to anyone, not a bank, not a boss, and certainly not your family's money." He turned his gaze back to Julian, and the ice returned to his voice. "Which brings us to the final piece of the story, the Northgate Tower." He reached into the portfolio one last time. He pulled out the contract. It was thick, bound, and bore the official seal of the city. He didn't slide it across the table. He held it. "You were so confident, Julian, so sure you were the only one who could make it happen. You were competing against me. The entire time. You were boasting to me about your strategy to defeat me. You were insulting me, belittling me, while I was sitting in the final negotiation meetings with the mayor." He finally placed the contract on the table, on top of the other documents. The final, crushing weight. "My firm, Evance Design, was awarded the Northgate contract yesterday morning. This is my copy, signed, final. The project is mine." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a demolition site after the dust has settled, revealing a landscape irrevocably changed. Julian was frozen, his face a grotesque mixture of shock, fury, and utter humiliation. He looked from the papers on the table to Ethan's calm, implacable face. The workhorse, the man with no vision, the minor leaguer. That man had just ended his career. The Northgate project was meant to be the crowning achievement of Sterling development, the thing that would finally cement Julian's legacy as something more than his father's son. Losing it was a disaster. Losing it to Ethan, that was an extinction-level event for his ego. "No," Julian breathed, shaking his head. "No, it's not possible." "Why?" Ethan asked, the question a genuine inquiry. "Because you had already decided it was impossible? Because in your world a person's worth is determined by the car they drive and the brand of watch they wear? You never once looked past the surface, Julian. You never once thought to ask a real question. You just saw what you wanted to see, someone you could feel superior to." Ethan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. "You didn't lose the Northgate project because my design was better. You lost it because you are a fool. Your arrogance blinded you. You were so busy looking down on me that you never saw me coming for you." The quiet bomb had detonated. The statement, simple and devastating, hung in the air. Julian finally broke. He lunged forward, not at Ethan, but at the papers on the table. He snatched up the contract, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. He was searching for a flaw, a loophole, some sign that this was an elaborate forgery. But there was none. The signatures were real. The seals were authentic. It was all true. He dropped the contract back on the table as if it had burned him. He looked up at Ethan, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. The arrogance was gone, stripped away to reveal the terrified, insecure man beneath. "You can't," he stammered. "Ethan, please. This will ruin me. This project, my company, we're over-leveraged. We were counting on this. You have to back out. Let me have it. I'll pay you. Name your price, anything." The titan of industry was begging. The man who, an hour ago, was advising Clara to leave her loser husband was now pleading with that same husband for his survival. The reversal of fortune was total and absolute. Ethan watched him, his expression unreadable. He felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't pity. It was a cold, clinical satisfaction. The moral mirror was now in front of Julian, and the reflection was hideous. "A price?" Ethan repeated softly. "You want to talk about a price now? What is the price for years of condescension, Julian? What is the price for the constant, casual insults? What is the price for trying to get a man fired from his job out of sheer petty spite?" He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where Julian's ostentatious car was still parked. "There is no price you can pay me, because this isn't about money. I have money. This is about respect, something you demand but have never learned how to give." He turned to face his wife. Clara was pale, tears streaming silently down her face. She was looking at him as if for the first time. The tapestry of their life together had been ripped apart, revealing a completely different picture beneath. She was finally seeing the man he truly was: powerful, strategic, and utterly in command. But she was also seeing her own role in the deception, her complicity, her failure. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't know." "No," he agreed, his voice losing its hard edge, replaced by a profound weariness. "You didn't know. But did you ever try to? Did you ever once believe that I could be more than what your brother said I was?" The question was gentle, but it was devastating. It laid the truth of their marriage bare. She had loved the man she thought he was, the steady provider, but she had not had faith in him. She had chosen comfort over loyalty. The foundation he thought he was building for them had in fact been built alone. Julian, seeing his appeal to Ethan had failed, turned his desperation on his sister. "Clara, talk to him. He's your husband. Make him see reason. This is family." The word family, coming from Julian's lips, was so grotesquely hypocritical that Ethan almost laughed. He simply looked at Clara, waiting. This was her moment of choice, the culmination of years of silent enabling. Would she side with her broken, begging brother, the source of her husband's long humiliation? Or would she finally, for the first time, stand with the man she had married? Her choice would determine not just Julian's fate, but the future of their entire relationship. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy with the weight of unspoken history and a future that was about to be decided. Clara looked from her weeping brother to the powerful, wounded stranger who was her husband. And for the first time, she had to choose. Clara's gaze shifted between the two men. On one side was her brother, the embodiment of the world she had grown up in, a world of status, appearances, and casual cruelty disguised as ambition. He was now broken, pleading, his mask of superiority shattered, revealing the desperate child beneath. On the other side was her husband, a man she was only just beginning to see. He stood not in triumph, but in a state of profound, sorrowful judgment. He was offering no comfort, no easy way out. He was simply waiting, his stillness a force more powerful than Julian's frantic panic. Her entire life had been a series of passive acceptances. She had accepted her family's values, accepted their assessment of her husband, accepted the quiet compromises that kept the peace. Now, for the first time, she was being forced to make an active choice. "Family?" she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through Julian's pleas. She looked at her brother, and for the first time the veil of lifelong affection was lifted, replaced by a clarity that was painful to behold. "You talk about family? Was it family when you mocked him at every dinner? Was it family when you tried to have him fired from his job?" Her voice grew stronger, fueled by a dawning, righteous anger. Anger at her brother, but also at herself. This whole time he was working, building this for us. And I, let you tear him down. I stood by and let it happen. She turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with a desperate, painful understanding. "He's right. I didn't defend you. I didn't believe in you. I was a coward." It was a confession, a full and complete admission of her failure. It was more than Ethan had expected. He saw in her eyes not just the shock of his revelation, but the deeper, more painful shock of self-realization. She was seeing herself through his eyes, and she was horrified by the reflection. Julian saw he had lost her. His last line of defense was gone. "Clara, you don't understand." "No, Julian," she interrupted, standing up from the sofa. She was no longer the passive observer. "For the first time, I think I do understand. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry the man you looked down on turned out to be the one holding all the cards." She walked over to the coffee table and looked down at the documents that had rewritten her reality. She pointed at the Northgate contract. "He earned this. He earned it with years of work that I was too blind and too weak to appreciate. You are asking me to ask him to throw away his masterpiece, the culmination of his life's work, to save you from the consequences of your own arrogance. The answer is no." The finality in her voice was absolute. Julian stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently. His sister, who had always been his ally, his audience, had just passed sentence on him. The betrayal, in his mind, was complete. He turned a hate-filled glare on Ethan. "You did this," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You planned this. You set me up. You humiliated me." "No, Julian," Ethan said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You humiliated yourself. I just built a better building." The simplicity of the statement was devastating. It wasn't a gloat. It was a simple architectural fact. All of Julian's social maneuvering, his bluster, his attacks, none of it mattered in the face of superior competence. Ethan had simply done the work, and he had done it better. He walked over to the front door and opened it. "I think it's time for you to leave my house." Julian was momentarily paralyzed by fury. He looked as if he might lunge at Ethan, but something in Ethan's calm, unshakable stance held him back. Defeated, he stumbled past Clara without looking at her and walked out the door. A moment later, they heard the roar of the Bentley's engine as it tore down the quiet suburban street, a final, impotent scream of rage. The house was silent again, but this was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the tense, charged silence from before. It was an empty, echoing silence, the kind that follows a great storm. Ethan closed the door softly. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his back to Clara, his shoulders slumping slightly. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a deep, hollow ache. He had won. He had achieved the vindication he had craved. He had demolished Julian and everything he stood for. But it felt less like a victory and more like a tragedy. He had been forced to use his greatest achievement not as a gift of love, but as a weapon of judgment against his own family. "Ethan?" Clara's voice was small, tentative, from across the room. He turned to face her. The anger was gone from her face, replaced by a landscape of shame and regret. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "That's not enough, I know it's not, but I am. I was weak, and I was blind, and I hurt you." "Yes, you did," he said. It was not an accusation, just a statement of truth. He was too tired for anger. "You let me stand alone, Clara, for years." "I know," she said, tears welling in her eyes again. Can we fix this? Can I fix this?" Ethan looked at her, the woman he loved, the woman who had been his partner and his blind spot. He saw the genuine remorse in her eyes, but he also knew that sorry was just a word. The foundation of their marriage, which he had thought was solid stone, had been revealed to be sand. It had shifted and nearly collapsed under the first real pressure. Could it be rebuilt? He didn't know. "I don't know, Clara," he said, and the honesty of it was brutal. "I don't know if we can. A structure with a flawed foundation can't be patched. It has to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. Are you willing to do that work?" It was the most important question he had ever asked her. It wasn't about the money, the success, or the tower. It was about her. Was she willing to excavate her own character, to find the weaknesses and the flaws, and to rebuild herself into a woman who could be a true partner? A woman who could stand with him, not just beside him. He saw the fear in her eyes, the fear of that hard internal work. But behind the fear, he saw something else, a flicker of resolve. The same resolve he had seen when she stood up to Julian. She nodded slowly, a single determined movement. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady for the first time. "Yes, I am." It wasn't a promise of a happy ending, but it was, for the first time in a long time, a start. It was the hope of a new blueprint. The weeks that followed were a study in consequences. The news that Vance Design had officially secured the Northgate Tower project sent shockwaves through the city's business community. The simultaneous, near-total collapse of Sterling development was the subject of rampant speculation. Julian, true to form, tried to spin a narrative of being betrayed, of corporate espionage, of a hostile takeover. But the story was too clean, the truth too compelling. The quiet architect had outmaneuvered the loud developer. The workhorse had won the race. Julian's reputation was shattered. His credit lines were pulled. His business partners, who had been drawn to his aura of success, abandoned him as soon as the stench of failure became apparent. He was forced to sell off company assets at a fraction of their value just to cover his debts. Within 3 months, Sterling Development was a hollowed-out shell, a monument to its owner's hubris. Julian's parents at first tried to intervene. They called Ethan, demanding he do the right thing and help his family. Ethan listened patiently before responding in his calm, measured tone. "With all due respect," he had said, "your son's problems are of his own making. For years you watched him belittle and disrespect me, and you never said a word. You enabled his arrogance. This is the consequence of that arrogance. Helping him now would teach him nothing. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for someone is to let them face the full consequences of their actions." There was no arguing with the cold, hard logic of it. They did not call again. During this time, an unexpected ally emerged. Marcus, the business associate who had been with Julian at the charity gala, reached out to Ethan. He requested a meeting. Ethan, curious, agreed. They met in the lobby of Ethan's office building. "Mr. Vance," Marcus began, looking humbled, "I was there that night, at the gala, and at a dozen other dinners and events where Julian, well, where he was himself. I want to apologize. I never said anything, but I always felt uncomfortable with the way he treated you." "Thank you, Marcus," Ethan said, appreciating the gesture. "It's more than that," Marcus continued. "I was a junior partner on a project with Julian 2 years ago. He cut me out of the deal at the last minute, took all the credit and the profit. He's a user. What you did, what you revealed, it was justice." Marcus then slid a folder across the table. "Julian is trying to liquidate his remaining land holdings to stay afloat. There's a parcel of land adjacent to the Northgate site. It's prime real estate. He's selling it for pennies on the dollar. You should buy it. It would be poetic." Marcus stood up to leave. "You're the kind of man people want to see win, Mr. Vance. It was an honor to be a footnote in your story." Ethan bought the land the next day, not for poetry, but because it was a brilliant strategic move for the next phase of the Northgate development. The most difficult work, however, was not in business, but at home. The grand revelation had not magically fixed his marriage. It had, instead, begun a long and painful process of reconstruction. Clara, true to her word, began the work. She started going to therapy, not to discuss him, but to discuss herself, to understand the ingrained patterns of behavior, the desire for approval, and the fear of conflict that had led her to become a silent enabler. She cut off contact with her brother, not out of spite, but as a necessary boundary for her own growth. She told her parents, in a difficult and tearful conversation, that her loyalty was to her husband, and that if they could not respect him, they would not have a place in her life. She and Ethan began talking, truly talking, for the first time in years. They didn't talk about architecture or money. They talked about feelings, about the hurt he had carried for so long, about the fear she had lived with. He was forced to confront his own part in the deception. His secrecy, born of a desire to protect his project and build a surprise, had also created a chasm between them. It had prevented true partnership. He had treated her as someone to be gifted a future, not as someone to build it with. "I hid it from you because I was afraid," he admitted one evening as they sat in the quiet living room that had once been a battlefield. "I was afraid that if I told you my plan, your family's skepticism would be a constant poison. I didn't want their doubt to infect my vision. But in protecting my vision, I shut you out. I made you a spectator in your own life. That wasn't fair to you. And I wouldn't have been strong enough to handle it," she admitted, her honesty raw. "I would have been terrified. I would have listened to Julian. I would have urged you to be safe. You were right to hide it. I wasn't the partner you needed then." She reached across the space between them and took his hand. "But I want to be. I'm learning how to be." It was a slow process. There were days of doubt, moments of regression into old patterns. But there were also breakthroughs, moments of profound, painful honesty that felt like setting a bone. She started taking an interest in his work, not just the results of it, but the process. She asked to see the blueprints, to understand the challenges. She visited the office of E. Vance Design, not as a guest, but as a partner. She met Maria and the team, and they saw in her not the vapid socialite they might have imagined, but a woman genuinely trying to understand her husband's world. The quiet, empty house began to feel like a home again, its foundations being painstakingly relaid, stronger and deeper than before. One evening, about 6 months after the confrontation, Ethan came home to find Clara in his home office. She had several of his old sketchbooks open on the desk, books from before he started his firm, from when he was just a young architect with dreams. "I was looking at these," she said softly. "You were always brilliant. It was always here. I never learned how to look." He came and stood behind her, and she leaned her head back against him. On the desk, next to the sketchbooks, was a framed photo. It was a new one, taken a week before. It was just the two of them, standing on the empty plot of land that would soon become the Northgate Tower, the city skyline behind them. They were both smiling. It wasn't a perfect, polished smile. It was a real smile, earned and a little weary, but genuine. It was the smile of two people who had been through a demolition and had decided to stay and rebuild. The future wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time, it was a future they would design together. In the end, this story isn't just about revenge or vindication. It's about the nature of true worth. Julian believed worth was something you displayed, with a car, a watch, a loud voice in a crowded room. He spent his life polishing the surface, while the structure beneath was rotten and weak. Ethan understood that worth isn't displayed, it's built. It's built in the quiet hours, in the dedication to a craft, in the integrity of your work and your character. It's a foundation, strong and deep, that can withstand any storm. The world is full of Julians, people who mistake volume for value and arrogance for strength. They build their lives on sand and are always shocked when the tide comes in. But the world also has its Ethans, the quiet ones, the patient ones, the underestimated. The ones who know that the most powerful statements are not shouted from the rooftops, but are built, brick by brick, into a reality that cannot be denied. They know that true strength isn't about how you look in the eyes of others, but about what you see when you look in the mirror. This story is a reminder that the respect you receive will ultimately mirror the respect you give, and that patience, when paired with purpose, is one of the most powerful forces on earth. It allows you to build in silence while others are distracted by noise, and to reveal your strength not when it is demanded, but when it will have the greatest impact. It's a lesson in letting others underestimate you, right up until the moment that their underestimation becomes their undoing. What did you think about Clara's choice in the end? Do you think she deserved a second chance? Or had she been a silent enabler for too long? I'd love to read your thoughts on it in the comments below. Your perspective is what makes this community so incredible. Thank you for joining me for this story. If you found yourself rooting for Ethan and believe that integrity will always win in the end, please give this video a like and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and satisfying justice. Until next time, remember to value the foundation, not just the facade.